Hey guys, tonight we begin with something a little darker before neon signs, before fast food, drive-thrus, before brightly colored wrappers promising instant sweetness and saltiness. The medieval world, Middle Ages. Forget the castles and chivalry Hollywood sold you. The truth, you probably wouldn't last a single day, so before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. It is a curious thing to think about, because when we picture the Middle Ages, many of us imagine heavy breads and endless porridge. We imagine austere monasteries and meager peasant tables. Yet beyond those cliches, there were bustling towns alive with smells of fried batter, sizzling fat, roasting meat, spiced wine, sweet pastries dripping with honey, and vendors shouting their wares to passers-by. This is where the medieval version of junk food lived, not in the halls of kings, not in the ledgers of knights, but in the streets on feast days, and in the stalls of market squares. Junk food in our world today means food that is quick to prepare, cheap to buy, delicious to the tongue, but often heavy in fat, sugar or salt. It is food that comforts and excites, but rarely nourishes. And so it was in the medieval world. Though the ingredients were different and the cultural context was distinct, the impulse was familiar. Vendors hawked hot pies filled with dubious meats, fried fritters dusted with sugar when sugar could be found, candied nuts slathered in honey, roasted chestnuts ready to crack open all of it, bought for a handful of coins and eaten on the move, without ceremony. We know from records that medieval fairs and festivals were often as much about food as they were about entertainment. If you walked into a meadow Ival fairground, the air would hit you first, thick with smoke from roasting spits, the tang of onions frying in animal fat, the sweet drift of honey cakes cooling on wooden boards for peasants who rarely ate meat. Such fairs were intoxicating moments of abundance, where one might spend their pennies not on durable bread or beans, but on a fleeting moment of indulgence, a bite of something fried in oil or dripping in honey, something that felt luxurious in a life of hard labor. Even the church, though it preached moderation and gluttony as a sin, provided occasions where feasting was not only tolerated, but encouraged. During holy days, food stalls sprang up outside cathedrals, markets overflowed with treats, and people indulged in ways that might surprise us today. The same men and women who heard sermons against indulgence would leave the pews to bite into fried pastries, spiced pies, or sticky wafers bought from a vendor waiting by the church doors. Junk food, then, was not an insult, it was a comfort, a break from the daily diet of bread, porridge, ale, and perhaps some cheese, when fortune allowed a fritter fried golden in oil, a meat pie hot and salty, a sweet cake infused with cinnamon. If one were lucky enough to afford imported spices, these were the pleasures that reminded people of celebration of humanity's love for flavor of life beyond toil and hunger. To understand medieval junk food, we must also consider the structure of towns themselves. Narrow streets lined with shops and stalls created a natural stage for food vendors. Travelers passing through could grab something warm and filling without needing a hearth. Merchants arriving after long journeys could revive themselves with a pie or hot soup poured into a crude wooden bowl. Peasants who had saved a few coins might bring their children into town and treat them to sweetened bread or honey nuts that stuck to their fingers and delighted them, just as children today delight in sticky sweets. And then there were the taverns, dim, smoky rooms where laughter and song mingled with the clatter of mugs and the hiss of frying pans. Taverns did not offer the balanced meals of a noble banquet. They offered instead salty snacks, heavily seasoned meat, roasted fish dipped in sauces thick with vinegar and garlic, fried offal, cheap ale poured generously to wash it down. This was the medieval equivalent of bar food, food designed not for nutrition but for companionship, laughter, and a few hours of forgetting the difficulties of the day. In many chronicles we find mention of street sellers whose cries filled the air. Imagine a man with a basket of hot pies, shouting their contents to entice buyers. Imagine a woman with a tray of sugared almonds glistening in the sun. Imagine roasted chestnuts steaming in winter air, sold by boys whose hands were blackened from the fire. These voices carried through town squares, creating an atmosphere that to us would feel strangely familiar. Because though the sounds were different, the purpose was the same: to draw the hungry toward food that was ready, fast, cheap, and irresistible. We must also remember that medieval foodways were deeply seasonal. In the depths of winter, when larders grew thin and meals became monotonous, the appearance of a vendor selling fried dough or roasted nuts was even more alluring during summer fairs. Fresh fruit dipped in honey or crushed into pies offered fleeting bursts of sweetness that peasants might not taste again until the next year. In this way, junk food was tied to celebration, to the cycle of the year. It was not everyday sustenance, but a treat bound up with the rhythms of medieval life. And while nobles enjoyed elaborate banquets filled with rare delicacies, the street foods of towns were democratic, shared by poor and middling folk alike. A fried fritter cost only a little more than a loaf of bread, but it carried the thrill of indulgence. It was food that could be eaten with the hands, food that left grease on your lips, food that for a moment made you forget the endless round of pottage and brown bread, and carried you into another world, the world of flavor, excess, and pleasure. In this way, medieval junk food was not so different from ours. It was food meant not for health, but for the senses. It was often heavy with fat, salt, or honey. It was easy to consume quickly. It was affordable compared to the rarities of high cuisine. It provided comfort, escape, and above all flavor. In a world where much of the diet was bland and predictable, these indulgences stood out like jewels, small edible luxuries that colored the otherwise gray palette of daily life. When you step into a medieval market square, the first sensation is not what you see, but what you smell. The heavy smoke from cooking fires lingers over the stalls, carrying with it the perfume of sizzling fat, the sweetness of honey, and the sharpness of spices in the air. Vendors call out to you, each one eager to convince you that their little morsel of food is the best bargain in the town. Their cries fill the narrow cobblestone lanes so that the very air seems alive with hunger and promise. Here in this crowded place, medieval junk food thrived. Theirs not hidden away in kitchens or grand halls, but in the open air for anyone who has a coin to spare. The simplest and perhaps most common street snack was the fritter, a humble piece of dough dropped into bubbling fat, sizzling until golden brown, and then plucked out with wooden tongs hot enough to warm cold hands on a winter morning. Sometimes the fritter was left plain, a crisp little pillow of bread. At other times it might be dusted with honey, or if fortune smiled, sprinkled with sugar. Rare and expensive, but unforgettable on the tongue. Fritters were cheap, quick to cook, and sold in piles from baskets lined with linen. Their greasy fragrance irresistible to children and adults alike. Beside the fritter seller, you might find a woman with a tray of small cakes made from oats and sweetened with honey. They were dense, chewy, and satisfying, offering the medieval sweet tooth something to savor in a world where refined sugar was almost as precious as gold. Honey was the sweetener of the common people, and they used it with abandon, dripping it over nuts, baking it into cakes, or stirring it into warm ale. The result was a sticky indulgence that left hands shining and lips glued with sweetness. Then there were the roasted nuts, chestnuts in winter, almonds in summer, cracked open and tossed in salt or honey. They were sold in paper cones or simple cloth bags. The scent of roasting nuts was enough to draw a crowd in the evenings when townsfolk gathered around braziers to warm themselves. Children tugged at the sleeves of their parents, begging for just a few pennies to spend on these small treasures. And the parents, though cautious with money, sometimes gave in because the pleasure of watching their child smile with a mouthful of roasted nuts was worth the cost. Bread, too, became a vehicle for indulgence, not the heavy brown loaves of peasant tables, but lighter buns, baked with butter or lard sold warm from the oven, and often sprinkled with spices, like cinnamon or nutmeg. If they were available at market day fairs, bakers turned their skills to creating sweet buns, sticky rolls, and pastries filled with dried fruit. These were not everyday foods. They were luxuries meant to be eaten, slowly, savored with laughter and chatter in the bustling market squares. If you listened closely among the noise of bargaining, you might hear the hiss of fish grilling over an open fire. Street sellers often prepared small fish caught that very morning, laying them across iron grates and brushing them with oil or vinegar. They were eaten hot with the bones pulled apart quickly, salty, smoky, and satisfying for towns near rivers and seas. Grilled fish was one of the cheapest and most popular snacks. Travelers and merchants would stop at these stalls to fill their bellies quickly before moving on with their trade. Another favorite indulgence came in the form of meat pies, a small pastry crust filled with pork or beef, or sometimes scraps of meat that could not be sold, otherwise heavily seasoned with pepper, garlic, and onions to disguise the questionable quality of the filling. The pie was baked until the crust was crisp and golden, and then sold hot to customers who could carry it in one hand. While walking through the market, meat pies were hearty, greasy, and delicious. They filled the stomach quickly and left the eater satisfied, even if they were not always entirely sure what kind of meat they had just consumed. Sweets, too, had their place in the medieval marketplace. Gingerbread was one of the great favorites, though it bore little resemblance to the soft cookies we know today. Medieval gingerbread was dense, dark and spiced, often shaped into little squares or cut into decorated forms. It was made with honey, breadcrumbs, and strong spices like ginger and cloves. The taste was intense, a fiery warmth that lingered on the tongue. Children adored it, and so did adults who could afford the spices that gave it life. Sellers carried trays of gingerbread wrapped in cloths to keep them soft. offering samples to tempt customers into spending their precious coins. Candied fruits were another treat when sugar was available. Apples, pears, and even citrus fruits brought from distant lands were dipped in boiling sugar syrup and left to harden into glossy jewels. The sight of such fruits glittering in the sun would have been almost magical to medieval eyes, for sugar was still a rare wonder, imported at great cost, and often locked away in noble kitchens. To see it coating a piece of fruit at a fair was to witness luxury, made edible, a tiny fragment of the exotic world beyond Europe, sold for a price just high enough to make it precious, but just low enough to tempt those who longed for sweetness. Drinks, too, were part of the street food culture. Mulled wine was common at fairs, heated in large pots, spiced with cinnamon, cloves, or pepper, and ladled into wooden cups. The warmth of it travelled straight to the bones. Ale was sold in jugs and mugs, cheap and plentiful, though often weak in strength. Vendors sometimes flavoured it with herbs to disguise sourness, and children, too, drank weaker forms of ale, as water was not always safe to consume. At special times, sellers offered sweetened milk, or posset, a mixture of milk and wine, curdled together and thickened with breadcrumbs. These were warming, filling, and comforting. Little indulgences, sipped slowly, as one watched jugglers, musicians and dancers performing in the square. As the day stretched on, the market grew louder, vendors shouting, buyers haggling, the clang of coins, striking wooden counters, and all the while, food was being prepared, eaten disc, arded and bought again. The ground beneath your feet grew sticky with honey, spilled ale and crumbs of bread, the air rich with the mingled smells of frying, roasting, baking, and spicing. People gathered not only to buy goods, but to eat together, to gossip, to laugh, to watch entertainers. All of it bound together by the presence of food that was cheap, quick, and above all delicious. It is worth remembering that for peasants who lived on little more than bread, beans, and pottage, these market foods were extraordinary. A chance to step out of the monotony of daily meals and into a world of flavour for a few coins a man could taste. Fried fish, spiced pies, or sweet gingerbread for a few pennies. A woman could bring home a honey cake to share with her children. These were small acts of joy in lives that were often defined by labour, hardship, and scarcity. The medieval market snack then was not merely food, it was a symbol of community, of celebration, of indulgence within limits. It was a way to take part in the life of the town, to share in flavours that connected rich and poor alike. For while nobles might enjoy banquets filled with rare game and imported spices, the pies, fritters, nuts and gingerbread of the market belonged to everyone. They were the taste of the people, eaten quickly, savoured, joyfully, remembered fondly, when the stalls were packed away and the fires burned down. And so as you drift deeper into the sounds of the medieval marketplace, let the cries of the vendors blend together into a lullaby. Let the scent of honey and spice linger in your imagination. Let the warmth of mulled wine and the crunch of roasted nuts carry you away. These were the simple pleasures that sustained the medieval soul, the snacks that filled not just the stomach but the heart, fleeting delights in a world where life was often uncertain and hard, but where flavour could still bring comfort, joy and rest in the medieval imagination. Sweetness was something close to magic for the poor. It was found most often in honey, sticky golden and drawn from hives kept near cottages or gathered from wild bees in hollow trees. Honey was medicine and food, sweetness and cure. A spoonful of it stirred into pottage on feast days, or spread across a hunk of bread, was a rare delight. Children licked honey from their fingers, while mothers scolded them to be careful not to waste a drop. And in that simple act, we can already see the outline of junk food sweetness that was not necessary, but deeply desired for the wealthy. Sweetness came from distant lands, carried on ships and camels. Sugar crystals, hard and white, stored in cones and cut with knives when needed. Sugar was more precious than almost anything else in the medieval kitchen, worth more than spices, more than meat, and in its rarity, it became a status symbol to serve. Sugared dishes was to show wealth and refi. Nemant banquettes sparkled with candied fruits, sculpted marzipan castles and gilded sugar statues placed on tables, not to be eaten at once, but to be admired as though they were jewels. When finally consumed, these confections dissolved into pure pleasure on the tongue. Gingerbread too straddled the line between rich and poor, for though its spices could be expensive, variations existed for all classes. The wealthy enjoyed versions drenched in imported ginger cloves, cinnamon and nutmeg bound with honey, and sometimes coloured with saffron to glow like gold. These gingerbreads were pressed into wooden moulds, carved with saints' beasts or coats of arms, gifts for festivals or offerings to guests. The poor, on the other hand, might enjoy simpler versions, heavy on breadcrumbs and honey. but the taste still carried the warmth of spice and sweetness, and for a child chewing a dense square of gingerbread, the world felt suddenly brighter. Candied nuts became another favorite indulgence. Almonds especially were treasured, dipped in honey, roasted with sugar, or rolled in spiced syrups. They were sold in little bundles at fairs and weddings. Their crunch carried both comfort and luxury alike. Roasted nuts coated in sweetness gave energy to workers, but also decorated banquet tables. And so, from peasant child to noble guest, the same indulgence crossed class lines. Sweetness was one of the few tastes that could bridge the gap between hut and hall. Fruit, when candied or preserved, also became a marvel. Apples and pears, simmered in honey or dipped in sugar syrup. Oranges and lemons, brought from the Mediterranean, transformed into sticky, glowing slices, sometimes perfumed with rose water. The wealthy displayed them as exotic treasures, but on feast days, even ordinary folk might see. Candied apples handed out as treats. The bright gloss of sugar catching the eye like polished jewels. Children must have gasped at such sights, knowing that to bite into one was to taste. A piece of wonder. Marzipan deserves its own place in this story, made from almonds and sugar, ground together into a paste. It was shaped into animals, birds, castles, flowers, even little knights on horseback, all of it tinted with bright colours and gilded with gold leaf. Marzipan was not for the poor. It was a luxury reserved for royal banquets and noble feasts, but its very existence shows how far the medieval love of sweetness could go. Sugar and almonds, imported at enormous cost, transformed into edible art that delighted eyes as much as tongues. When finally eaten, it melted slowly, sweet and nutty, a lingering indulgence fit for kings' drinks too. Carried sweetness, spiced wines mulled with honey were sipped by nobles and townsfolk alike. In winter, possets thickened with honey or sugar offered warmth and indulgence. Honeyed meads, celebrated at weddings, festivals, and feasts, filled mugs with golden sweetness that flowed into laughter and song. In these drinks, sweetness mingled with warmth and alcohol to create the medieval equivalent of comfort food, something to chase away the chill of winter or the heaviness of labor. The symbolism of sweetness cannot be ignored. It represented joy, love, abundance, and sometimes even holiness. Honey was linked with the promised land, flowing with milk and honey. Sugar was tied to wealth and prestige. Ginger and spices carried with them the aura of distant lands and mystery. When people bit into these indulgences, they were not only tasting food, they were tasting dreams of other worlds. A bite of gingerbread might carry the imagination to the spice routes, a sip of honeyed wine to visions of paradise. In this sense, medieval junk food was more than indulgence. It was escape, a small vaco. Chin of the senses from the burdens of everyday life, and yet even as sugar and exotic fruits dazzled the wealthy, the humble honey cake still held its place in the hearts of the poor. Small loaves made with oats, rye or barley, sweetened with the thick syrup of local hives, baked in hearths, or sold by vendors. These cakes were dense, chewy, and utterly satisfying for children. They were joy for workers. They were energy for all. They were reminders that sweetness did not have to be distant or rare. It could be gathered from nearby fields, crafted into simple cakes, and enjoyed by anyone with a coin or two. To picture the medieval world of sweet indulgence is to imagine fairs filled with gingerbread stalls, wedding feasts glittering with sugared almonds, royal banquets sparkling with marzipan, castles and humble cottages where mothers spread honey on bread, for children who grinned sticky-faced and content. It is to see how sweetness was at once common and rare, democratic and elite, humble and exalted. It existed in many forms, crossing social lines, while still marking distinctions between those who could afford the exotic and those who made do with the local. But in every case, it brought joy, and so the medieval sweet tooth reveals itself not as something modern, but as something timeless. The craving for sugar, honey cakes, nuts, candied fruit, gingerbread and marzipan echoes across centuries. The same longing that today sends us reaching for chocolate bars or fizzy drinks once led peasants to honey cakes and nobles to sugar sculptures. In this craving we find a bridge across time and class, and we see clearly that junk food, though modern in name, is ancient in spirit. Imagine yourself stepping into a smoky tavern on a damp medieval evening. The straw on the floor is damp from boots and the air is thick with laughter, the clatter of mugs, the drone of a minstrel in the corner, and always the smells drifting. G from the kitchen behind the bar. Here food is not carefully balanced or delicately plated. It is fried, roasted, salted to keep drinkers hungry and thirsty. Again, food designed not for health but for pleasure and profit. This is the realm of savory junk food. The king of this world was the meat pie, a crust baked until crisp and golden, stuffed with pork or beef, or sometimes mutton or goose, often seasoned heavily with onions, garlic, pepper, or cloves to disguise whatever cuts had been tossed inside. The crust was thick enough to hold in the juices and strong enough to be carried in the hand, making the pie the perfect medieval street snack. Workers grabbed them on market days. Travelers ate them on the road. Tavern-goers devoured them between mugs of ale. They were cheap, filling, and delicious, though many joked that one never knew what animal truly lay inside sausages. Two filled the streets and taverns made from scraps of meat, ground together with fat, salt, and spices, then stuffed into intestines. They were grilled over open flames or fried in pans until their skins snapped and their juices hissed into the fire. The taste was rich, fatty, salty, and immensely satisfying, sold by the link wrapped in rough paper, or eaten straight from the fire. Sausages were the quick meal of merchants and the indulgence of peasants who managed to spare a few coins in many towns. Fried offal was another treat sellers gathered. Livers, kidneys, hearts, stomachs, anything left after the best cuts of meat had gone to nobles and markets. Fried quickly in animal fat sprinkled with salt and sometimes onions, they became savory mouthfuls, strong in flavor and heavy in grease. These were not foods for refinement. They were foods for hunger and comfort, carried in small wooden bowls or eaten from skewers, hot enough to burn fingers, but too tempting to wait. Cheese also played a part in the savory indulgences of the time, not the carefully aged wheels of noble banquets, but the crumbly, salty, rough cheeses made in villages, sold in chunks, wrapped in cloth or leaves, eaten with rough bread or fried into golden cakes. Cheese was aphor. Stable for many and satisfying in its richness when paired with ale, it became the medieval equivalent of bar snacks, salty enough to make one drink more hearty enough to keep the stomach from emptying too quickly. Fish, too, was turned into junk food. Salted herrings fried in pans, grilled eels sold on sticks, small fish coated in batter and dropped into oil until crisp. These were eaten hot at fairs and markets, their bones crunched between teeth, their salt sharp on the tongue. For inland towns, fish was a luxury, but for coastal villages and riverside markets, it was the everyday fast food of choice. Fishmongers set up stalls by the water, frying and selling their catch to anyone who wandered by. Bread again became a vehicle for indulgence in savory form. Stuffed breads filled with onions, cheese, or bits of meat flavored with herbs and baked until fragrant. These were sold at fairs to travelers who could eat them in the hand without need for plates or spoons. The smell of baking bread stuffed with savory fillings drew crowds, just as it does today, at bakeries. The medieval equivalent of the modern sandwich, quick, easy, and satisfying. And then there were the stews, thick, salty, and often spicy pots of meat. Vegetables and grains simmered for hours, served in wooden bowls to tavern-goers. These were filling, comforting, and often consumed with great hunks of bread used to soak up the greasy broth. Stew was the kind of food that lingered in the stomach, keeping hunger at bay long after the fire had burned down, and while it may have begun as a meal of necessity, it became another form of savory indulgence, cheap, quick, and shared among companions. The culture of savory junk food was tied closely to taverns, gatherings, and fairs. It was food meant for company, for noise, for laughter and drink, salty enough to make ale sweeter, fatty enough to keep bellies warm, spiced enough to create excitement in a world where most meals were bland and repetitive. It was also food of survival. Using scraps, bones, offal, and whatever could be spared, nothing was wasted. Everything became an indulgence, once fried, salted, or wrapped. In pastry for the poor, savory junk food meant a moment of luxury, a break from porridge and pottage for the wealthy. It meant novelty and entertainment at feasts. Nobles sometimes delighted in eating rustic pies or spiced sausages prepared by cooks as a playful nod to common fare. Even kings enjoyed roasted nuts, fried fish, and heavily seasoned stews when they wished to indulge in the tastes of the people, though always with better ingredients and finer preparation. What makes savory junk food so timeless is its appeal to the senses, the crack of a pastry crust, the sizzle of meat in fat, the smell of garlic and onions, frying, the warmth of cheese melting on bread, the salt that lingers on lips, the grease that glistens on fingers. These experiences tie the medieval eater to the modern one. We recognize them instantly because they still live with us today, in pies, sausages, fried foods, cheesy snacks, and salted fish. As the medieval evening deepens, the tavern grows louder, the mugs clink more often, the fires roar and the savoury smells never cease. Food comes out in waves, pies followed by sausages, platters of fried offal, bowls of stew, chunks of cheese, skewers of fish, all carried around by serving boys and tavern maids who shout and laugh as they work. This is the world of savoury junk food. Food that fills the belly, quickly. Food that encourages one more mug of ale. Food that binds friends and strangers together in the glow of firelight. Food that is not elegant but unforgettable. And so when we think of medieval junk food, we must picture not only the sweet treats of fairs, but also the savoury indulgences of taverns and markets, pies, sausages, fried morsels, cheese, fish stews. These were the tastes that sustained joy in the medieval world, hearty, greasy, salty and comforting. The foods that turned hunger into satisfaction and labour into laughter. The foods that were never meant for health, but always meant for the heart. Think of a pie, golden crust flaking beneath your teeth. Savoury filling spilling out steaming hot. The medieval traveller eating a pork pie on the road is not so far removed from the modern commuter, grabbing a meat-filled pasty at a train station. The form, the recipe, the flavour may have changed, but the impulse remains the same. Food that can be carried, eaten with one hand, enjoyed on the move. Filling and comforting pies still rule bakeries and fast food shops. Centuries later, because they answered a hunger that never changed, sausages too survived their humble beginnings. They became refined into bratwursts, hot dogs, chorizos. Yet at heart, they remain the same ground scraps, salted, spiced and stuffed, to be grilled, fried or roasted, still eaten on sticks, still sold at fairs, still sizzling with grease sausages today. Carry the same appeal as they did when medieval vendors waved them in smoky markets, calling out to hungry crowds. Fried food, perhaps the greatest legacy of all, lingers everywhere from fish and chips to onion rings to fried chicken. The medieval love for battering fish, dropping it into oil, frying morsels of offal or cheese until golden never disappeared. It expanded into a culinary empire. Modern fried food is faster, crispier, cleaner perhaps, but the concept was alive centuries ago, whenever hot oil hissed in tavern pans and travellers burned their fingers for the reward of crunchy, salty flavour. Sweets too. Carry on gingerbread houses, candy stalls, caramel nuts, candied fruits. These are direct descendants of medieval treats. Modern carnivals, with their spun sugar and candied apples, owe their heritage to the fairs where sellers hawked honeyed nuts, candied plums and spiced cakes. The medieval sweet tooth built the foundation for our own, the idea that indulgence could be sold, wrapped in paper sprinkled with sugar, and carried away to be eaten in joy or secrecy. Cheese the sale. Thai companion of ale remains the bar snack of choice, from fried cheese sticks to pub platters. The logic has never changed. Salt, fat, protein and satisfaction. Medieval tavern keepers knew that cheese kept. Customers drinking modern bars know the same truth. The thread runs unbroken through the centuries. Bread stuffed and flavoured still endures, whether as sandwiches, empanadas or stuffed flatbreads. What medieval bakers sold at fairs still finds its way into our fast food chains. The portable stuffed bread, the meal that could be eaten in motion, lives today in the fast bite culture of cities across the world. Bread became the most democratic of medieval junk foods, and remains so. Now, but perhaps the greatest legacy is cultural, not culinary. The medieval fair and tavern taught us that junk food is not just about filling the stomach. It is about community, about atmosphere, about indulgence at the right time. Medieval fairs thrived on the excitement of stalls clattering with sweets, nuts, pies, sausages and drinks. The joy was not only in the food, but in the shared experience. Modern fairs, carnivals, food festivals and street markets carry this exact spirit. Centuries later, eating with others, food tied to laughter, music and noise, food meant to be enjoyed, not dissected or measured. Junk food also reflects class and survival in the Middle Ages. The poor tasted indulgence when they could through fried scraps or sweetened pottage. The wealthy flirted with rustic pies or candied fruit prepared with finer ingredients. But the impulse was the same. Indulgence is universal. This legacy remains visible today, where junk food crosses class divides, offering the same pizza, burger, pie or sweet to anyone who desires it. And in health too, the legacy lingers. Medieval doctors often scolded about spiced pies, fried fish and candied nuts, warning of humours and imbalances, yet people ate them anyway. Today, nutritionists warn of fats, sugars, salts, and yet the world still lines up at stalls and shops for the same indulgences. History repeats itself, not because we do not learn, but because pleasure is part of being human. So is why. Dumb. Outside, perhaps listening to this voice drifting towards sleep. Think of the way junk food has been with us through centuries, from smoky taverns to glittering city streets, from fairs in muddy fields to carnivals with neon lights, from gingerbread baked in medieval ovens to the gingerbread men still baked for holidays, from sausages fried over medieval fires to the hot dog carts of modern cities, from pies baked in rustic crusts to the takeaway slices of today. History never left your plate in this. We see not just food, but continuity. A thread binding us to ancestors who laughed and ate, who licked grease from fingers and sugar from lips, who gathered in noise and song, who shared indulgence and found joy in the smallest bite. The medieval world may be gone, its castles fallen, its kings forgotten, but its junk food lives on in every sweet stall, every fried fish shop, every bakery and every tavern, where laughter and hunger meet so close your eyes. Now, if you wish, and imagine the echoes of those fairs, the smell of honeyed nuts, the sizzle of sausages, the warmth of pies, the clatter of mugs, the laughter rising to the rafters, because history is not only in books or ruins, it is in the food you eat, the cravings you share, the indulgence you allow yourself. Junk food is history, alive on the tongue, and that is the legacy of medieval junk food, not just a record of what was eaten, but a testament to what it means to be human, to hunger, to crave, to indulge, to laugh, to share, to eat, not only for survival, but for joy.